Okay, so welcome back to the second video of the first portion of ultraviolet visible spectroscopy. In the previous video, we learned a little bit about what the UV and the Vis stood for in the actual name of the instrument. UV represents ultraviolet and Vis represents visible. And we said that this is a spectrometer. So a spectrometer is a meter that measures light, and the light that this instrument uses is a UV and visible portion of the spectrum. Again, we have many different instruments in the laboratory. Those instruments look at different pieces of the electromagnetic spectrum, but for the UV vis portion, which is what you're watching now or what you're trying to prepare for a competition, we only focus on these two pieces of the spectrum, and that is it. So, one of the first questions that many people have is, how did all of this get started? Right? Where did this come from? How did it get started? Who was the person that invented it? How long ago did it happen? So, how fairly new, maybe, is the technology? Well, the UV Vis instrument goes back and it dates into the 1930s. And during this time, we had a group of researchers, a group of chemists, a group of biologists, a group of laboratory technicians that was working in a laboratory, and they were doing studies on vitamins. And I want to pause just for a minute and talk about this term called a vitamin, right? So a lot of people, I don't like to take things for granted. But a lot of people will look at the term vitamin and they don't understand kind of the chemical context that happens from this word. So vita means vital. Okay, this means that it's important. And what they thought is that we had a compound that was very important to life. Without these vital compounds, your body would shut down and you could possibly die from it. So we took this word vital, we shortened it down a little bit, and we used the vita portion of that word. And the amin, A-M-I-N, is representing amine. And an amine is a type of compound. This type of compound is referenced in organic chemistry. And an amine is anything with a NH2 group that's hanging off of the chemical structure. So these scientists, these researchers were working with these compounds that had NH2 group or NH2 related groups on them. These are termed amines in the organic chemistry world, and they said without these compounds, your body would shut down and you would die. So we get this term called a vital amine or a vitamin that comes from that nomenclature. So these people were in the laboratory, and what they were doing is that they were doing studies on these vitamins because they thought that they were very important. They wanted to know, how did they work? How could we synthesize them? How could we make them? Could we improve the vitamins? If we could improve the vitamins or the vital amines that we give you, then maybe we could improve your life. So this began in the 1930s, and the first vitamin that they really was playing with was vitamin A. So they would take vitamin A into the laboratory, and they noticed that vitamin A loved ultraviolet light. So they thought this was kind of strange. What is making vitamin A love and eat up ultraviolet light? And they began to do studies on it. So what would happen if they changed the ultraviolet light to something else? Or what would happen if they changed the concentration of the vitamin A that they had in their sample? You know, what was going on? What was the relationship between the two things? Well, around this time, the United States government actually got involved with the research and development as well. So the United States government took an interest, and they came to these researchers and they came to these laboratory technicians and lab workers, and they said, we have a special purpose for you. We are giving soldiers rations, and we want you to measure the vitamin content of these foodstuffs that we are providing or these drinks that we are providing. Because we want to make sure that our soldiers are staying healthy. We want to make sure that these soldiers can be ready to fight for us and not have a vitamin deficiency while they are away from the United States. So we see a perfect marriage between the United States government's interest and current science interest, and they morph together and they use the funding and they begin the studies on ultraviolet measurement 3 and 4 and 5 fold during this time because now they had the resources to do it. So finally, 10 years later in the 1940s, we start to see a ultraviolet visible spectrometer that was commercially available. Up until that point, it wasn't really mainstream. But in the 1940s, we started to see companies purchase UV vis spectrometers because it was now available and because they knew a little bit about the theory and because they knew the purpose of what we could do with it. The Beckman was the first ultraviolet visible spectrometer. This happened in 1941. So Beckman is just the instrumentation manufacturer. That's all that it is. So it's like a pair of jeans. We have different brands. Well, spectrometers, UV vis spectrometers, have different brands. The very first original brand was the Beckman. Now, Beckman said, this is going to drive down your production. Or your production time. It's going to drive down your production cost. It's going to allow you to get data at a much quicker rate. And this could be seconds compared to the minutes or the hours of what it took before the instrument came out. And I also put in here that Beckman was also the first pH meter as well. So if you know a little bit about a pH meter and what it does, you can thank Beckman for that because he was really the leader with that instrument as well. And we do call that an instrument, believe it or not. So here's Mr. Beckman. And this is a picture of the first UV vis spectrometer that was available during that time. And honestly, quite honestly, our UV vis spectrometers do not look anything like that anymore. We have kind of grown from the 1940s. We've improved our instrumentation. We've improved the capability. We've improved the sensitivity. We've began to look for other pieces and parts that make the instrument do a better job than what it did many, many years ago. But that was the first UV vis spectrometer that was commercially available. So if you take a look at the advertisement, it says that this is a quartz spectrophotometer. Spectrophotometer is still used. Depending on the age of the person, some people will use spectrophotometer and other people drop the photo out of it and use spectrometer instead. They both mean really the same thing. It says a new self-contained precision instrument with quartz prism operating on an electronic circuit for the rapid measurement of percentage transmission and density. Okay, so this quartz is going to be important. We're going to mention this a little bit later on, so remember that. And this transmission term is also very important. We have came further than transmission nowadays, so we don't really look at transmission anymore, but it's still a setting that I have on any UV vis spectrometer that I can use, but we just don't really measure transmission. But this was the first kind of go-ahead, right? So we knew that it worked, but again, years and years and years of improvement have led us to years and years of better equipment with better data analysis, and transmission is not used anymore for the measurement purposes of a spectrometer. So you can go on down and take a look at the advertisement. It gives you a little bit of the background about the instrument and what it can do. And they called this the Model D. And the reason is because they had 3 other versions of this instrument before it became mainstream. Model A, Model B, Model C, and then finally we get the Model D of the spectrometer. They equated this Model D very similar to the Model T. The Model T, though, was for Ford. And this boosted and bursted and just ballooned up the automobile industry during that time. It was so revolutionary. And with this Model D spectrometer, we kind of give the same respect to this instrument as we do the Model T car. And the reason is because this was an instrument, one of the first instruments that was commercially available for laboratories to do work. And it made their work easier. It made their production quicker. It produced very reliable data and results. And this was a leader during that time. So there's Mr. Beckman, over 35,000 units sold. It originally started out as the National Technologies Laboratory, and then it became the Beckman Company. And the selling feature of this piece of equipment was given to biochemistry and clinical labs. They had a very specific use for a UV-Vis instrument, and biochemistry and clinical uses a UV-Vis instrument maybe on a daily basis. So for instance, I can do DNA work, and DNA work, some of that can be done on a UV-Vis instrument. I can also maybe look at contamination for blood and figure out maybe what kind of metals are there, like iron. So do I have high iron or low iron? And we could use a UV-Vis instrument to do that as well. So this is where it began to find its home. And of course, clinical labs and hospitals and clinics and doctors' offices would love this type of instrument. And it's a very common laboratory that you would see across the United States. So that's where it's made its home. That's where it began to get known. And that's Mr. Beckman. So we can give him a round of applause for making this instrument for us. So this is where this video will stop. We'll come back, and in the third video we'll pick up with some more lecture theory and talk about some more terminology that you will need to become familiar with before we go further and further into this description.